This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Tack. It's Wednesday, so that means it's Chad Oban and I on the show. And later in the show, you're going to hear Senator John Hoeven. And this is a little weird because Senator Hoeven got delayed when he was connecting up with us. You're going to hear the interview. We've already done the interview. You're going to hear the interview after we do. So you may hear us referring to what Senator Hoeven is going to say because that's the order that you're going to be listening to it. It's the magic of podcasting, folks. Speaking of which, as always, I start the show talking about thanking you listeners for tuning in. Certainly appreciate that and urging you to subscribe to the podcast on a podcasting platform like an app or something if you're not, so you can be notified when there's new episodes. That's awesome. I also encourage you to subscribe to the forum so you can read what I write and what a lot of other talented people write. I have it on I don't know. What I heard is that if you subscribe, you will be better looking and lose weight. I don't know that these have been fact-checked claims. You know, maybe we need the FDA or something to check those out, but it could be true, right? I don't know.
Sounds a little Trumpy.
It sounds a little Trumpy. Okay,
Rob.
All right, fair enough.
A lot of people are saying you lose weight if you subscribe to the forum. A lot of people are saying it.
So one of my favorite writers of all time. I'm going to immediately go into an anecdote here and pour the hell out of everybody. But one of my favorite writers of all time is Hunter S. Thompson. He's the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas guy. I wrote for Rolling Stone. His politics were not my politics. His lifestyle definitely wasn't my lifestyle. But man, I love the way that guy wrote. He was amazing. But he had this great anecdote. I was watching this documentary about him, and I think it's on Netflix. It was a documentary that Johnny Depp produced. Johnny Depp portrayed Hunter S. Thompson in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Anyway, so they were doing an interview. It was like on the Merv Griffin show or something like that. It's on some talk show, and Hunter Thompson had been covering the 1972 presidential election, and during that election, one of the Democratic candidates, Edmund Muskie, Hunter S. Thompson had been writing the stories about how he was addicted to Ibogaine, right, which was some like pharmaceutical drug that was intended to treat. Anyway, he started this. And so he was asked about it on this talk show, and he's like, well, your sources are rumors in Poughkeepsie. And he says, yeah, I started the rumors in Poughkeepsie about about Edmund Muskie being on Ibogaine, and then I reported him. And then he had this great line. He goes, you know, if you pay attention, I'm actually really accurate. Anyway, that's my Hunter S. Thompson anecdote about. But as for whether or not you will be better looking and lose weight if you have a forum subscription, I don't know. Maybe
time will tell. Time will tell.
With a good diet and exercise and a forum subscription, you will lose weight. How's that?
I think that's a good mixture.
Speaking of feedback, we've been getting a lot of good feedback on the show. I had somebody email and say that they were on a ski trip and they used past episodes of the podcast to keep them company on the long drive. Although she added this part, she said that her daughter told her that the podcast put her to sleep. So I figured that must have been the parts where you were talking, Chad.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's funny, the feedback I get is generally, about 1/3 of the podcast is good when you have guests on, and about a half when there's not guests on are good. It's just the parts when I'm talking.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that's probably true.
Both my mother and my mother-in-law are now starting to listen. So my mom gave me some great feedback the other day. She's like, I really like the podcast. I agree with everything you say, Chad. And so I've got Alice Oban in my camp.
Well, there you go.
Good luck.
I tell you what, if you lose your mother, you're, I don't know, you need to rethink.
Yep, but I've got her firmly in my camp.
All right. So we're going to talk. It was an eventful week since we last talked in North Dakota politics. We have a new attorney general now. He's going to be sworn in today if he hasn't been already. Drew Wrigley appointed.
I think he has
been. Yeah, this morning. Yep. Appointed to replace Attorney General Wayne Stenjum. We also obviously have the Becker challenge to Senator John Hoeven. And let's talk about that. You're going to hear about. So we asked Senator Hoeven about it in the interview coming up. But let's talk a little bit about that from a political perspective about what the angle is there, because I don't, and I wrote about, I mean, this was my initial take. I don't think he honestly thinks he can win. You're talking about Chad, and I say this, I am 100% in favor of people challenging people in primaries. I don't have a problem with that. I think every politician should have to work for it. If Becker wants to make Hoeven work for it, hey, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think he honestly thinks he can win. So I was kind of thinking the angle might be that he's going to run for the Senate to try to create some momentum for his down ballot Bastiat Caucus legislative people. And I'm wondering, and the only problem with that is like the district conventions are like halfway over already, and we're not that far away moved from the state convention. So, I mean, if that was his intent, boy, he got into the game late.
Yeah, I think I've got two thoughts on it. One is, is he attempting to raise a national profile here of some kind? He clearly likes the punditry. He clearly likes to be on TV. Is he going to really throw some bombs here and try to become a Fox News talking head or something like that? Just
not even Fox News. I mean, anymore, you could be on Newsmax. You could be on One American Network or whatever. I mean, you don't have to be on Fox News to be striving for that.
Right. And so I think that might be part of it, because it just felt like it happened really rapidly, that it went from I'm not running for anything to putting out a pretty well-produced video announcing his campaign. But the second thought is where you just went. Is this a way to help motivate people to get to district conventions to nominate Bastiat-type legislative candidates?
And Bastiat-type delegates to the state convention as well.
Right. And I've never known Rick Becker to be too selfless when it comes to helping others, but maybe that is what his goal is here, is to help down ballot. I also didn't get an indication that he for sure would be running in the primary. I mean, he's been pushing people to the convention, right? I mean, has he said he's running in the primary too, or just the convention?
I haven't heard, because for those of you who don't know, in North Dakota, the parties hold endorsing conventions. Like the Republican, I think, is like April 1st and 2nd. The Democratic convention, what is it? It's usually a couple weeks after or a week after, something like that. I don't know. Late March, early April, the parties hold their endorsing conventions. But the actual final say on that in terms of ballot access is the June primary. So, what the candidates end up doing is they compete for the endorsement at the convention, but that's not the final word. If you lose at the convention, you can run to the June primary. Recent history, Republican candidates did that. Doug Burgum did that in 2016, came in third place at the convention, ran and won in a landslide, beating Wayne Stenjum in the primary. Kevin Kramer did that as well when he ran for Congress. So, that's kind of the history. And I guess that's always the question is, the question is, will you abide by the convention? Which is to say, you won't run to the primary. I mean, if he's serious about the Senate, then I think he's got to say, I'm going to run all the way. Now, the thing, though, is if he loses in June, he can't then go on the general election ballot. Like, if you ran for and lost the party's nomination in June, by law, you can't be on the general election. Now, if you lose at the convention, but you skip the primary, you can be on the statewide November ballot as a
libertarian,
as an independent or whatever. Yeah.
Something. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see. I agree with you 100%. Rick Becker is not beating John Hoeven in a primary. I mean, John Hoeven, I think I don't obviously agree with everything John Hoeven does, but he's a juggernaut when it comes to popularity in this state. I managed Joe Satram's campaign against him in 2004. I know a little bit about how popular John Hoeven is. What's that?
That's a blast from the past. Joe Satram.
Well, I like to say that I ran the most successful competitive campaign against John Hoeven in 20 years, and I think we got 27% in that election. Yeah,
the only time John Hoeven has gotten less than 70% on the statewide ballot was the first time he ran for governor against Heidi Heitkamp, and even there he won decisively. I mean, it wasn't particularly close. By the time we got to the final ballot.
I think Becker has an angle here. I don't know what the angle is, but I don't think it's to be a U.S. senator from North Dakota.
Do you think? So let's take it serious. Let's set aside our skepticism about how competitive he's going to be. What are things he could do to be competitive? And one thing that I've heard is, could he get Trump's endorsement? Right? Could Trump reach down into the state. And I have a column about this that's going to be going up sometime after the podcast. And my argument was, I'm not sure that, Trump's going to be interested. I mean, is John Hoeven on Trump's radar? I mean, John Hoeven's not out like throwing bombs. He's not a Liz Cheney. He's not out throwing bombs. I don't know why he would be on Trump's radar to begin with. Is Becker the sort of candidate that Trump would even endorse? I mean, let's face it. If you want Trump world's, endorsement, adulation of Trump is kind of, a required. And I've always thought that Becker is I think he very much likes pandering to the Trump crowd and the Trump supporters. It's hard for me to see him sort of going on bended knee to get Trump's endorsement, which is sort of the requirement. So first of all, I'm not sure. And then the other part is, what's Trump's endorsement even worth in North Dakota? Because remember, last cycle, he endorsed in another primary in North Dakota for the state treasurer. As unlikely and completely weird as that was, he endorsed Dan Johnston in the race for treasurer. He endorsed him, and he had some other Trump world figures like Mike Lindell were sending support, and they couldn't put Dan Johnston over the top against Thomas Beadle. And Beadle, I was looking at the election results today, he even did well in western North Dakota counties. He won Williams County, he won Montreal County, he won Mercer County, he won Oliver County. That's oil and coal country. If Trump can't put Dan Johnston over the top against Thomas Beadle, and no offense to Thomas Beadle, but he's no John Hoeven, in oil country and coal country, then, I mean, what's Trump going to do against John Hoeven? So I asked the question and then I answered it completely myself. So
I appreciate that. I'm just here to encourage you.
Yeah.
No, but I think the first piece of it is, I don't think John Hoeven is John Hoeven referenced it in the interview people are going to listen to. His voting record is the same as Kevin Cramer. At the end of the day, it's not like this Senator Hoeven is, beating some anti-Trump, never Trumper sort of drum out there. So I can't imagine Trump wanting to engage here on somebody who has been relatively loyal to where he's at on things, or certainly not aggressively going after Trump. As to if it would be effective or not, it depends on what comes with the endorsement. It's one thing to send out a postcard or a tweet or whatever, but would he be raising money or coming to the state?
Trump
or sending
can't tweet
people?
Anymore. So
What's that?
He can't tweet anymore. So the Twitter
he'd have to
endorsement's
find a different medium to get his message out. Really, one paragraph, poorly written press release maybe is the approach that he would take to get the information out. But
yeah,
I can't imagine Trump plays in this. It's just there doesn't seem to be enough upside.
I don't see that. But that was the big speculation is what if Trump got involved? Could he suddenly make this competitive? And I think the answer is A, I don't think he's going to get involved, and B, even if he did, I don't think he moves the needle enough, right? I mean,
but what do you think the trigger was? I mean, literally, Becker told his district less than 2 weeks ago that he wasn't running for anything. I mean, he was in the press on his show saying, I'm not running for anything. And then all of a sudden, U.S. Senate. I mean, something had to have sparked that. I mean, it doesn't feel like this was something he was thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would have to go back and look at his wording. I mean, at least I don't know what he told his district. I wasn't in the room, but I mean, in terms of his public statement, I mean, did he say that I'm not running for anything? I mean,
I thought that's what he said. He won't be on the ballot in 2022.
Yeah, I would have to look, but I think I remember you're right saying that. So what could the trigger be, do you think? That's what kind of made me think that it's about helping his little political machine that he's got going there is trying to be at the top of the ballot to help them out on his way out the door of politics, because that was my indication even from people I spoke with who are relatively close to him, was that he was pulling up stakes, not going to be involved in electoral, at least as a candidate, in electoral politics anymore, and then all of a sudden run for, I mean, it does seem like a bit of an about face.
Yeah, well, I think selling the businesses. I mean, I've heard some rumors that he was going to be moving out of state. At some point here, and it was just a surprising turn of events. I mean, I didn't even realize he'd announced until the following day. I saw it I clearly wasn't on social media enough, but I didn't see that one coming. Did not see it coming.
The other thing that a lot of people want to ask is about his TV show. Becker's got a little TV show that he does, and I can't say that I've watched more than maybe cumulatively maybe 15 minutes of it. But I apparently there was a question because the FCC has an equal time thing, and I know this from when I used to broadcast on radio. Is during election season, if you have one candidate on, you have to at least offer equal time to the other candidate. So if Becker's got a show, I don't even know how, is he on every night or is it once a week? I guess I don't even know.
No, it's multiple times a week. I don't know if it's every night though.
Okay.
I think it depends on the high school basketball schedule right now.
But Adam Willis actually has an article about this in the forum today, which you can read, by the way, if you have a subscription. In addition to being better looking and losing weight, you can also read Adam's article about this. But, it's Becker said in the article that he planned on terminating his contract at some point and not broadcasting anymore. But Beck made it sound like they'd be happy to just give equal time to John Hoeven. And why wouldn't they be? Right?
Yeah. Have John Hoeven host a show a couple days a week. I think that'd be good for Beck's rating.
Or Hoeven's one of Hoeven's surrogates or something like that. I mean, that would be, Beck would absolutely love that. Now, the likelihood of that happening, I think, is probably pretty slim. But
when my wife was running against Gary Emeneth hosted guest hosted a couple times on KFYR, and she called up KFYR radio and said, "Hey, equal time." And so Aaron got, I think, like 5-6 hours worth of free airtime on KFYR radio by using the equal time thing.
Yeah, well, good. I don't know how I feel about the government telling broadcasters that they have to do that, but I mean that's the law. So
that's the law.
Here we are. So anyway, that'll be kind of an interesting. Although Becker again said that he intends to terminate the contract, so maybe it'll be a non-issue. But that would be kind of fun to watch. But
I love the pivot from Beck trying to get Hoeven to host a show on their little network.
Well, Beck would be if I was the president of Beck Communications, I'd be absolutely pushing for that.
Yep.
Absolutely, I want my network to be the battleground for this Senate primary, as short-lived as it's going to be, because it's going to be over in early June.
Yep.
All right. So we got all that covered. What else is going on? Drew Wrigley
getting a point. I think your point, Rob, about does the Becker U.S. Senate race affect legislative races is really important. I mean, I think we saw up in District 15 in Devil's Lake, Dave Elke, a longtime sort of normal Republican, lost.
Outed by Judy Estenson.
Yes, and then we've got, I think Jessica Bell's convention is coming up pretty quick, again, getting challenged from the right. Bob Erbely's getting challenged for Sebastian Ertelt down in 28. I mean, there is clearly a movement by the far right in this state to move the Senate in a big way. And so Becker getting people to those conventions, could make a big difference.
Yeah, well, yeah, because especially at some of those local conventions, a dozen votes can swing it, right? I mean, it's not, depending on where you're at, those are very easily influenced. What's also interesting because that's where kind of the Bastiats have always been their strongest, is in those conventions, because they're so easy to influence. You put some butts in seats and you can influence the outcome. The problem they have is on the actual ballot. I think they really struggle there. And I think even if Becker gives them a little bit of a shot in the arm, I think overall this is going to be a rough year for the Bastiat candidates.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing is going to be, will these incumbents, if they lose at the convention, decide to go into the primary, or are they going to throw their hands up and say, I don't need this.
Yeah.
I don't need this, because I think they win at the primary. But if I were them, I'd be thinking long and hard if this is a job that I want, if it's worth it.
Well, that's some of the tactics. And I think that's going to be Becker's tactic too. I mean, what's he got to lose at this point? He's going to come out guns blazing, right? I think everything, it's going to be the Republican. I mean, because in his video, he's talking about corrupt Republicans, right? I mean, it's going to be really, it's always going to be reminiscent of what Doug Burgum did in 2016, where he's talking about the good old boys club and everything else, which I think the governor probably regrets to this day, because it really, I think, hindered his ability to be effective as a governor in some ways, where he has to work with some of the people that he was simultaneously Republicans, members of his own party. I think that was probably a mistake. But in Becker's situation, he's not going to win. After this, he's not going to be holding elected office. So what has he got to lose?
Well, I think Burgum, I think you're right, and that primary did set himself up for some. I mean, the good old boy breaking up the good old boys. Well, every time he appoints another Drew Wrigley or Brian Crocius, my Twitter feed is full of people saying so much for breaking up the good old boys network.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a continuation of the good old boys network.
I would add that this is a network of people that North Dakota voters have consistently voted for over and over and over again.
Fair.
Yeah.
I didn't say I was agreeing with this necessarily.
No,
I think periodically he could appoint a woman to one of these statewide offices.
That's fair. Yeah. I guess. I don't like the identity politics thing. I mean, I don't know. I go back and forth on it. I don't like the idea of just appointing somebody because I'm trying to check a box somewhere. I think that sucks.
But Rob, I would suggest there are very, very many qualified female candidates for these statewide offices, much like there's a lot of qualified African-American women to be on the Supreme Court.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I think that saying that I'm going to appoint somebody from this demographic, to me, isn't a problem. It only becomes a problem if you start appointing people who are not qualified or don't deserve to be at that table.
Yeah, from a societal perspective, I wish we could get beyond it and just say, I'm just going to appoint the people that I think are best. And I don't care what their skin color or their gender is. I do get a kick out of the conservatives complaining about Biden when Reagan essentially did the same thing. Yeah, well, that's absolutely fair. And George H.W. Bush, frankly, did the same thing with Clarence Thomas. So, I mean, it's a thing. It exists. It doesn't mean I have to. Just because Reagan did it doesn't mean I have to like it, Chad.
No, you have to like everything Reagan did.
I have to like every single
conservative
thing. I'm a conservative, so I have to like everything that Ronald Reagan did. All right.
Did you see me do air quotes when I said conservative?
Yeah, I was going to criticize you that. You don't realize it's an audio medium, Chad. Nobody can see you when you're doing that.
Well, I think there's a lot of people in the Bastiat Caucus right now who appreciate my air quotes when I called you conservative.
Yeah, that's probably true. Which is fine. I mean, that is so much of what's going on because it's such a litmus test. Litmus test world right now, and I used to think that was a lot more important than I do now. I mean, there was a time where I thought it was really funny. Rick Becker was talking about his American Conservative Union ranking, like the average North Dakota voter gives 2 figs what his ACU ratings is, but he's got 100% rating from the ACU, so that's I guess that's great for him. Although, scuttlebutt is that Rick Becker kind of has some influence on which bills they score to. I haven't confirmed that, but there's a lot of lawmakers who are like, well, they're Becker bills. Like Becker, they choose Becker's bills for scoring, and of course, Becker has 100% ratings on Becker's bills.
Listen, as somebody who's been involved in putting together scorecards, I don't think anybody should suggest that maybe groups don't look at who voted which way when determining which bills they're going to score. I mean, there is obviously a little finger on the on the scale.
I think I honestly I don't care about ratings. I sometimes, like, if it's an issue centric rating, like I think the NRA rating on or even if you want like an anti-gun group, like their rating on an issue, I think could sometimes be valuable. But even there, you have to be careful because their fingers on the scale. But like this whole, like, I'm going to rate how conservative people are. Well, what does conservative mean? Because obviously it means very different things to very different people. I don't think Donald Trump's a conservative, but there are people who tell me that I'm not a conservative because I don't support Donald Trump. What does that even mean? It's an exercise in futility, which is why I quit doing my ranking, to the chagrin of people like Rick Becker and Luke Simons, who beat me up for it because I quit doing the ranking. They thought I was hiding something. I just thought it was pointless. What am I even trying to measure here?
I remember when Rick Becker, I think North Dakota United gave him like an 8% rating or something like that. And he did a video to say how disgusted he was that he didn't get a 0. That he can't believe he voted with North Dakota United one time on one bill that I'm sure everybody voted for. But
which is kind of what I mean. Again, stipulating to the idea that he's taking this campaign seriously and expects to win, which is in doubt. I think this idea that North Dakotans want another, like, sort of hidebound preening ideologue in the Senate is foolish. I don't think that's what voters want. I don't think that's what voters want. I think there's a reason why John Hoeven, who is not a bomb-throwing politician, who is not someone who rushes to the headlines, is not a reactionary, whatever else you want to say about him. There's a reason why he consistently gets 70% of the vote.
Part of the deal of being in the U.S. Senate is to be in the room, right, when decisions are being made. And if you go into the Senate and you're a bomb thrower or whatever, I'm sorry, those guys aren't in the room. John Hoeven has a chance to be in the room because I wish he was more moderate, quite frankly. I think in a 50-50 Senate, he could be the Joe Manchin of the Republicans, where literally he is the linchpin on everything. That's not where he's at, and that's fine. But he is in the room often when they're negotiating things like a bipartisan infrastructure bill. He makes sure North Dakota's taken care of.
He could call up Amy Klobuchar and move the needle with her.
Yeah.
Right? He could call up Joe Manchin and move the needle with him. Right? And I think that's what North Dakotans want for a senator.
And Rick Becker, on the other hand, would go to the Senate, and there'd be maybe 10 Republican senators who he'd have a relationship with, because all the rest he'd offended by saying something terrible. Although I will say, Rick Becker is sort of charming. I like when you spend time with him or whatever. I can get why, but if you're saying crappy things about all your colleagues all the time, eventually they're not going to want to have anything to do with you.
I think Rick Becker is a very personable person. I think on a personal level, I think he's very generous in some ways. I've talked to some of his former employees who have told me that he's a good boss. That's great. I can't ignore what he says publicly or in the political arena,
right.
But sure. I mean, that's great. Anyway, let's see. To the surprise of nobody, Drew Wrigley's the next Attorney General. You a little bit critical, I guess. Good old boy club. I saw some of those.
Well,
tweets
I mean,
too,
a little bit critical, but I mean, it was the most expected outcome. You know that.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, it's one thing to say, well, you should have picked. Which women threw their hats in the ring, though?
No, I think that's fair. I don't know who the pick would have been. You know, I mean, you have two options if you're the governor, right? You set up somebody for re-election by creating an incumbency sort of thing, or you have a placeholder, and you put a placeholder into that spot to just keep the office going. So maybe is it Troy Seibel, who's the deputy? You move him up just to keep the office going until the next election.
I think that would have been
an option.
I was kind of anti-placeholder because it's not Secretary of State, right? It's not the insurance commissioner. The Attorney General's asked to make some very consequential judgment calls. And I would rather have somebody in there who plans on being accountable to the voters at some point, making those judgment calls, as opposed to a placeholder who knows he's not going to run, or he or she's not going to run for election to the position. You know, I'm kind of anti-placeholder. I mean, another office maybe, but I think you had to put somebody in who intended to run for the office.
And it's 10 months, right? It's not like it's just a few weeks of somebody being in that spot.
Right.
10 months is a pretty significant amount of time. And Drew is going to be fine in the job. But to your point earlier in all your columns, it was the least surprising announcement. You know, Brian Crocius for tax commissioner sort of threw me off. This one, if it would have went a different direction, I think my head would have exploded.
Yeah, Bergam appointed Crocius, and that had me like, because I was doing the math. I was like, well, it's got to be Wrigley, right? Like, this is the only way it makes sense. Like, I'm trying to map it out. But it's like, but he appointed Crocius, so he
still has to appoint a PSC commissioner too, doesn't he?
Yeah. That's been an interesting process, I guess.
Well, now the listeners and I want to know what that means, Rob.
Well, I would like to know what it means too, but that's all I've been told so far. But I'm going to work on, because that's my whole job, right? To try to pull the curtain back and try to expose some of this. So I'll try to get more information about the PSC thing, but
it's been a while. I mean, Crocius was appointed quite a while ago to the tax spot. So
yeah. The PSC probably less urgency because it's a triumvirate, but
yeah, you still got the two people there.
That's kind of a plum job, but not really. I think Kevin Cramer led a lot of people into believing that the PSC is sexier than it is because he used it as a stepping stone to Congress. But that job, although I mean it's a plum in some ways because it's 6-year terms.
Yeah, I think the 6-year term is the biggest reason why it's a good gig.
And also, I mean, it's a nice salary, right? So but it's a lot of a lot of very down in the weeds regulatory stuff. That's important. That's important. Don't get me wrong, but it's not a sexy political office. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was, but I talked to somebody right after they're elected to the PSC, like 6 months after, and they're like, sort of boring.
Yeah.
There's not that much stuff going on here. And so to try to, make sure that you're out there and meeting with the people to fill the time, but not a sexy gig.
That's kind of the funny thing about Kevin Cramer is he, whatever else you want to say about him, he is very much a kind of mix it up, says provocative things. He is that guy, but he combines it with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of policy at times. I mean, I would host I'd have him on the radio, and I would have people call in and just ask him questions. And somebody would call in about some obscure trucking regulation, right? And I'm ready to yeah, the congressman will call you, because there's no way that Cramer, but Cramer's oh yeah, well actually I had a meeting about that 2 weeks ago, and we have a hearing coming up, and and I was really concerned about subsection whatever. I'm what in the world? How? I mean, I shouldn't be shocked that he's good at his job, but kind of was.
I've never had a policy discussion with Kevin Cramer, so I don't have an opinion on how encyclopedic his brain is when it comes to policy.
I'm not saying that you have to like his positions on the policy, but he knows what he's talking about at the very least.
Rob, I assure you, I don't like his positions.
I assure you,
most of the time.
Yeah, we didn't need to probably stipulate that. Well, we're all out of time, Chad. So we covered a pretty. There's so much to talk about, though. There's so many things that we want to get to, and it's just not enough time.
When I was thinking during the Hoeven interview, we could have kept him on for 2 hours. I got through maybe 1/8 of my notes that I was prepared to talk about.
It's just tough. I mean, we gotta talk about his primary challenger. We gotta talk about what's going on in the RNC, because that's gonna color races across the country. I think the food fight that's emerging from within the Republican Party. But there's other issues. There's a fight in Congress over investing. Should members of Congress be allowed? Senator Hoeven's he comes from a banking family. He's been very successful in his own right. He's got a lot of wealth. He comes up a lot where he has a blind trust. I know you wanted to talk with him about that. I was interested in some of his answers, but you just don't have enough time. There's so much going on. But hey, there's always another show, right? Just like there's always another election.
Yep. Look forward to next Wednesday. And shout out to all the GOP legislators who are listening to us. I heard last week from a lot of them.
In my experience, because I see all the people who I guess I don't see all the people who listen, but I get feedback from all the people who listen, and there's a lot of Democrats that listen too, but who aren't going to admit it publicly. Just like they admit. I get emails from Democrats who will trash me publicly, but we have lively interactions privately. So.
Well, if Democrats want to give me some positive feedback, I'd appreciate that.
Give you some positive feedback. Well, you probably have to do something that's worth positive feedback first.
Good talk. Good talk. You know what? We're going to lose that Oban bump in ratings pretty soon if you're not nicer.
All right, now we got to let Chad go, and we're going to move on to our interview with Senator John Hoeven. Joining us now is North Dakota Senator John Hoeven, and a busy man today. He kind enough to fit us in between committee hearings, and at some point here during the interview, he may need to go and attend to the business he was elected to do. But Senator Hoeven, certainly thank you for making time for us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet, Rob. Good to be with you and Chad.
I wanted to first of all, wanted to ask you. You're getting a primary. You're not getting. You have a primary challenger, State Representative Rick Becker, who announced previously that he was not going to run for re-election to his legislative seat. Announced that instead he's going to challenge you for the North Dakota Republican Party's nomination for the U.S. Senate, and kind of throwing some when he was in his announcement video and in some of his comments to the press, was explaining some of the reasons for running, and he's saying that there are very few consistent and principled Republicans once elected. He says that he called you a big government Republican. He said that essentially you're a career politician. First question: what's your reaction to getting this primary challenger and some of the things that Representative Becker said about you?
Well, I've had challenges before, primary challenges before. I think the last one was Paul Sorum, the first time I ran for the Senate back in 2010, and there's been others. So, I've had, and I think I've had a Libertarian candidate against me most of my elections in the general, obviously Democrat opponents. So, I'm used to having challengers, and I just typically focus on what I do and try to do the very best job that I can, obviously, for the state of North Dakota, as well as our country. And, I'll continue to take that approach. And I'm happy to talk about any issue that I work on. And I just try to do it with North Dakota common sense, the way that I think our citizens want me to approach it. And I'll continue to do that. So, and my track record's out there. I'm conservative, but I think I work hard to get things done for the state. And I think we're going to talk about some of those today, and that's great. And my focus is always what best serves the citizens of North Dakota and what's best for our country.
Hey, Senator, thanks for joining us here today. And first of all, good to hear your voice. I understand you had to deal with COVID last week, so I'm glad you got through that without any problems.
Thanks, Chad. Appreciate that.
Yep. One of the things that Representative Becker has talked about was your vote in favor of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Can you talk a little bit about why you voted for that, and most importantly, from my perspective, what's in it for North Dakota? I mean, it seems like this is one of those things that historically has been bipartisan and been good for states like North Dakota. And I have a different partisan label, but I like things that are good for our state, like you do. Can you talk a little bit about that vote now that you're being criticized for it?
Well, actually, it is about infrastructure, and we do need infrastructure across the country, and we can touch on some of the infrastructure impact it's already had for North Dakota, like the funding for the Red River Valley Flood Protection Project, $437 million. This now brings the federal commitment to $750 million, which we now have in hand so they can go forward with that project. We have the local, the state, and the federal funds in place. We think this can be built and operating maybe by 2026, operating in 27. That's huge for the whole Red River Valley region. And we're using this new partnership, public-private partnership, that is going to enable us to do it faster and save taxpayers money, which means property taxpayers in the region will pay less because it's built more rapidly at a lower cost. And that means they not only save on their property tax bill, they're going to save by not having to buy flood insurance. So you want to talk about what's conservative, that's saving our North Dakota people a lot of money right there. It also had funding in there for the Minot flood project, Rob, up where you are in Minot. This will enable us to get 60% of the protection done through phase 5. And we've got the funding to do it now. That covers 60% of the people up there. Same thing, helps them with their property tax, but also helps them by not having to buy flood insurance. And the sooner you get to that point, obviously the better, because then they don't have to pay those premiums. So those are the kind of projects that are in the infrastructure package. And it's actually, the numbers have been confused. It's not an 8-year, $1.2 trillion bill. That's what the Democrats wanted. We talked them down to, it's actually $550 billion. I hope I said 1.2 trillion. They wanted an 8-year, $1.2 trillion bill. That's not what it is. It's actually $550 billion over 5 years on top of the regular highway bill, which is about $400 billion. So it's $950 billion, but only $550 billion in new spending. And that's over a 5-year. That's the infrastructure, the kind of things I just talked about. There's no tax increases, and it is paid for except for about $250 billion, which is actually recycled ARPA money, which was the American Recovery Plan Act. That's a social spending bill that Democrats passed on their own, $1.9 trillion earlier this year, which I opposed, and we actually recycled that. So it's paid for, plus we recycled that social spending into infrastructure here. But beyond that, it's enabled us to work with Manchin and Sinema, and we've now been able to stop the Build Back Better, which is a $5 trillion plan. So in essence, for an additional $550 billion, mostly in infrastructure, we stopped $5 trillion in spending. Now, I get in a soundbite, you can go out and say, oh, well, I would have just voted no on everything and somehow that would be better. But it seems to me, if instead of spending $5 trillion on a bunch of entitlement programs that will never, ever stop, we spend some money, $550 billion additional on infrastructure where we get something for it, and with no tax increases, and we either pay or recycle money that's already been appropriated, that's the kind of thing that I'm sent here to try to figure out and help do, again, for our citizens in North Dakota and for the country.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Because again, in the context where, nationally, we're seeing all of these divides. The Republican Party is divided. The RNC is condemning Republican members of Congress, and just I saw in a statement this morning was suggesting that critics of their recent resolution about January 6th were living in a Washington D.C. bubble, and now you have a challenger here in North Dakota who's talking a lot about ideology. In his announcement video, he's talking about his rating from the American Conservative Union. There seems to be, and I really appreciate what you just went through in that bill, where we're talking about flood control, we're talking about infrastructure spending. I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in this ideological fight, who's more liberal than who's more conservative than who, and we get so wrapped up in labeling that we forget the whole reason you guys are in Washington is to take care of things like, hey, let's make sure our communities don't flood, and let's make sure our bridges don't collapse, and let's make sure schools are adequately funded. Can you talk a little bit about that struggle to get things done versus posture for what seems an unquenchable appetite among Americans for political theater?
Yeah, good question, Rob, and it kind of picks up right where we left off on the last answer. Again, by working with Manchin and Sinema, by giving them a place to land, they're now working with us. So, for example, how about breaking the filibuster? Without them, Senator Schumer would have broken the filibuster. Okay, what does that mean? That means they can pass with 50 votes. They can make Washington, D.C. a state. They can make Puerto Rico a state. That'd be 4 more Democrat senators right now. They could pack the Supreme Court. They could say, okay, we're going to take the Supreme Court to 15. So instead of President Biden appointing 1 liberal judge, now I guess he could appoint 6 more, and they'd have a majority on the court. What happens on life issues and other things that are very, very important to conservatives? So by working with Manchin and Sinema, we have stopped that. And if we can now win in 22, Republicans can win the House, maybe the Senate, we can stop their tax and spend agenda going forward and win in 24 and start to get back to the right kind of policies that we should have, the kind of policies that are pro-growth, where we reduce the tax burden, we reduce the regulatory burden, we empower people, we get away from these mandates. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And you have to be able to work with people to do that. And so, again, I think that's a great question and a great example. And when you talk about what's conservative, well, look, I'm pro-life. I support our military. I'm strong on law enforcement. I'm against mandates. I mean, if you look at me as an individual and how I approach things, clearly I'm conservative. So it's a lot more than just voting no all the time, and it's a lot more than different ratings. And you know how these ratings can go. I mean, I think if you looked at most of the ratings and compare Kevin Cramer and myself for the time Kevin's in the Senate, which is apples and apples instead of these apples and oranges comparison that some people try to make, you'll see he and I vote the same. So I don't think many people would say, well, Kevin's not conservative. So again, you gotta look beyond some of these kind of ratings that all the different groups have.
Senator, you brought up Build Back Better and Manchin and Sinema, and one of the things that's been frustrating me about this debate is it seems like it's like the size of the amount of money that's being spent is the narrative, not necessarily what's in the bill. And the lack of senators coming together maybe on the pieces of Build Back Better that can get bipartisan support. Do you think there's any chance that this thing gets broken down in a way where pieces of it can get passed? I mean, I'm personally concerned about child tax credit, child care, pre-K, some of those kind of things that seem to me could pass if it's not part of this huge package. Do you think there's any way that the parties will come together, break this thing down, find things and Build Back Better that they can agree on and to move something?
Well, Chad, I think right now we've got to find a way to tamp down the spending. I mean, there's been so much money spent on COVID. Frankly, we should have a balanced budget amendment to control this, and we've got to stop the growth of spending. There's just no question about it. And I think you probably follow Joe Manchin, who he's been a good friend of mine for years. We were governors together, and now we've been in the Senate together here. But if you look at what he's saying, hey, don't bring a bunch of spending programs that you sunset in 1, 2, or 3 years and then match it up with some revenue source, raising taxes for 10 years, and tell us that that's paid for. That's not the case at all. And that's why when this Build Back Better plan was put out there, the House tried to say, oh, it's, I think they were saying it's, 1.5 trillion in that range. Well, on a straight up score where you run both the revenue side and the expense side, the programs on a true 10-year basis, it's 4.9 trillion. And you've started all these programs that once started, you'd never stop. So listen to what Manchin's saying. He's coming at it the right way. He's saying, okay, if you want to make a case that you need one of these programs, then if you're going to put it in place, don't act like you're going to sunset it in a couple of years. Know that that's going to continue. Say what the real cost is, and then, talk about how you're going to finance it. And I think that's the problem with this Build Back Better approach. So, no, there's not going to be support for approaching things the way they're trying to do it. And there shouldn't be. We do have to get on top of the spending.
I think it's really interesting because one of the things, getting back to this sort of ideological argument, I'm super conservative, so elect me. And again, I'm a conservative. I want the people we elect to govern conservatively. I think that's a good thing. That's the philosophy I want. But I think in there, and I think this was to your point, Senator, I think there has to be a recognition that the other side exists. Even when you have the majority, the other side exists. At some point in the future, they will probably be the majority again. And so you have to govern in a way that you can work with them consistently over time. Would you agree? I mean, it seems, I think the Manchin and Sinema thing is perfect. You vote for the transportation bill. Maybe a lot of people in the conservative base don't like that. But what you're doing is you are making a deal with members of the Democratic Party that you can make a deal with. And then in turn, they're also working with you. I mean, that to me is the model for how Washington is supposed to work. Is everybody just too short-sighted? Is everybody just seems to be governing for the news cycle and not the long term?
Well, that's why, it's important we talk about these issues in more detail, right, Rob, so that we can actually go through and then people can decide, well, does that make sense or does it not make sense? And you're right, we got to get beyond a soundbite to do that. And you've got to build relationships with people. And so, for example, again, in terms of working with somebody, Amy Klobuchar and I work together on a lot of things. Matter of fact, we'll be up there doing a joint deal on trying to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. And you saw what happened with the family in Moorhead just recently. It was just tragic. And so we're trying to work on that. But not long ago, the two of us got together, the delegation from Moorhead, Shelley Carlson, mayor, and her whole group, Mayor Mahoney and Minot Group, or the Fargo Group and the Diversion Authority. And we go in to see Shalanda Young, who is the OMB director, acting director. So Amy and I go in there with the whole crew, and we sit down and we talk about why this flood protection in the valley should be fully funded now than, just getting a little bit in dribs and drabs and then try to keep the construction going. But instead, no, let's do it and get it all done. Because I have those relationships as well as some seniority here now, I can go in and sit down with these people and do it. And so we're talking to a Democrat OMB director, but to Kevin Cramer, he gave one of her speeches to get her approved at his budget committee hearing. That's the kind of relationship building we have to have. And I have to tell you, Senator Cramer and Congressman Armstrong are really good at it. They're smart, they're respected, and they do exactly what you just said, Rob. I couldn't have two better people to work with.
Let's shift gears and talk about the RNC issue right now, which I realize is a partisan issue, and the two people that they censured were part of the House, Representative Cheney and Representative Adam Kinzinger. But a number of senators, including your minority leader, Mitch McConnell, came out and condemned that. They condemned the resolution which said that that the January 6th riot was legitimate political discourse. They condemned two Republican members of Congress. Minority Leader McConnell came out and said basically the RNC shouldn't be picking and choosing among Republicans. I'm paraphrasing here. And also disputed the idea that he called the January 6th riot an insurrection. I know Senator Cramer has been among other senators who has weighed in on this and was critical. In fact, right on this podcast last week, he was critical of the RNC resolution. What are your thoughts on that resolution?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of censors. And I think our Republican representatives to that meeting voted for it. But you got to remember, it was part of a package. There were a number of resolutions, so I don't remember how many there were, but they voted for the whole package. So I mean, I think that's what happened there. But at the same time, I got to say, the House process is a partisan process. In the Senate, if you recall, Rob, we use the committees of jurisdiction, so the Rules Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, to review January 6th. So they did it on a bipartisan basis. Both committees had jurisdiction. They worked together, and that's how it should be done. Now, in the House, as you know, Speaker Pelosi would not allow the Minority Leader McCarthy to put Republicans on the committee,
including our
Kelly
own,
was going to be
our own Congressman Armstrong.
And
yeah,
Kelly, and who would do a better job than Kelly? I mean, he's a lawyer. He litigated. I think he was a public defender at one time, so he's got all this experience. And then to not allow these guys to be seated. That I mean, do you think for 1 minute if McCarthy were the majority leader that Pelosi would have said, "Oh yeah, that's fine to have a committee where she couldn't put her Democrats on the committee"? So I think that is not the right approach. That's not what they should be doing. And so I think it is problematic that Cheney and Kinzinger are on that committee, because it's a partisan process, not a bipartisan process.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're sort of losing a little bit of sight on the RNC messaging saying that January 6th was legitimate political discourse. I mean, I think that's ridiculous, regardless of what the other resolutions were in the package. I don't think the RNC members from North Dakota or any state should have described that as legitimate political discourse. Do you see it as legitimate political discourse, what happened on January 6th? I mean, you were in the Capitol.
Well, for people that broke the law, they need to be held accountable. And as you know, I've said that before. It's one thing when if you or anyone else comes down here at any point and wants to protest, you do it peacefully and within the law. That's your right as a citizen. But if you break the law and so forth, then you need to be held accountable under the law, and that is what's happening. And as far as our representatives, I think if you talk to Perry Schaefer or the other ones, I think they'll tell you that they aren't necessarily supportive or a fan of censor. But when it was all packaged together, they were in a situation where, they would in essence be voting against a number of resolutions versus any one resolution. But that's a question for them to answer.
I did ask Perry about that for the record. What he told me is that he personally was against the January 6th resolution. He delivered a speech against it, but ultimately voted for it, trying to show unity for the whole package of resolutions, I guess. But that's a question and an interview for him who voted on that. But this
and Rob,
sure.
Rob, that's right. That was my understanding. That's my understanding.
But speaking about, I mean, right now, Republicans coming up to the midterms here, I think most people agree are looking pretty good in terms of the polls. Like there's a pretty good chance that we're going to see one, maybe both houses of Congress flip over to Republican control. So I think what a lot of people are saying right now is what are we doing by continuing to relitigate 2020? But our former president, Donald Trump, continues to, I mean, he's the one who talks about it probably more than just about anybody. And now you have the RNC weighing in. Do you think this is a distraction? Does this help or hurt Republicans?
Well, you started your question with the right answer. I mean, clearly we need to focus on winning in 2022, right? I mean, and to do that, we've got to bring people together. I think we've got to follow Reagan's rule that, if you're with me 80% of the time, you're my friend and ally, and I need to work with you. And this isn't new to me. I think my focus has always been trying to pull people together. Go back to Ed Schaefer. I mean, the reason when Ed started, we were obviously, it was what people forget down here. The House is Democrat, the Senate has Democrat majority, and the presidency, the White House is Democrat. The Democrats control the whole works. And I think people forget, when Governor Schaefer started out, and then when I came in, there was still a lot of Democrat control in the legislature in North Dakota and in a lot of the statewide offices. And you got to get people together and work together and have some give and take if you want to get the majority. And you can't govern if you don't have the majority. And so absolutely, that's what we've got to do. And it's very important for 22. And that's true whether it's we can't take our majorities in North Dakota for granted either, because when we do, that's when we lose them. We need to work together. We need to recognize that, we're a big party. Different people have different ideas. They're free to express them. But we have that debate and that discussion. Then we got to get together, win the elections so that we can govern. And like I say, that is absolutely job one for 2022 here in D.C. when Democrats control, like I say, House, Senate, and the White House.
Yeah, and I agree. I wish the whole country could move on from November of 2020, because Rob and I have talked a lot on this show, the fear of what happens in 2024 if the Democrat loses the presidency. Does that just create a situation where now Democrats are trying to tear down the Capitol because something they don't like something that happened in the election? And I think that we just need to be careful that we are moving past that and not giving any sort of credence to this idea that January 6th was acceptable. So I hope we can move on from that. I fear that Washington is not able to move on from that, and that leads to one of my questions for you. You've been there for nearly 12 years, looking to stay for another 6. Washington has gotten more dysfunctional over those 12 years. I think it's silly to think it started with Trump. I think anybody who thinks it started with Trump, it started way before that. What do you see moving forward as your role in bringing the parties together and bringing the country together and bringing North Dakota together over the next 6 years? You talked a lot about Klobuchar and Manchin, but are there other things that you see you can do as a U.S. Senator from North Dakota to bring us together?
I do, Chad, and I actually appreciate that question. We're probably going to have to wrap things here, guys, because they called a vote about 15 minutes ago, and so I'm going to have to go. But absolutely, one, having been here and built some relationships and having some seniority, which is very important in the Senate, not only puts me in a position to chair committees important to North Dakota. I already am chair of ranking on Ag and Probes, and I've chaired Indian Affairs, and so on the Ag committee, the Ag Authorizing Committee, I'm actually second behind Bozeman. So I have some ability, I have some relationships to try to bring people together, both in our party and with Democrats, to get some things done. And the other thing I would say is my approach, Chad. I think most people that know me is I'm not out there throwing bombs all the time. I try to be somebody who works with people, who listens to them. I have that background as a governor where you had to do that. I honor and respect the grassroots and their opinion. And so I hope I have an approach that is conducive to doing what you just said. I think we need more people that are willing to work together to try to achieve some good outcomes for our state and the country. And so I'm conservative. I have my conservative principles, and I'll continue to honor them. And I respect other people's approach and their principle. But you still got to find a way to work together, as you said. So. Well, gentlemen, I am going to have to go. I do thank you I again apologize for being late to the discussion, but thank you for the opportunity to visit with you.
Well, the great thing about a podcast is it starts when it starts. And I had told you before we started that I knew we were shoehorning this in between votes and committee hearings and to let me know when you had to be done. So, which you did. So we'll let you go right now. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator.
All right. Yep. Thank you.